Well, thank you so much. Yeah, so I'm originally from Columbus, Ohio, and in the Midwest. And a lot of people originally for decades were not even thinking about Asian American and Pacific Islanders outside the West Coast. But the reality is that the communities have really been increasingly becoming bigger and expanding to a number of different states since the 2000s. And actually in 2020, we actually grew it over 10% in every single state, white where we're already. But growing up in the Midwest is one college at the Ohio State University 6 years after the killing of Vincent Chin. It was actually a case in Detroit, Michigan, where he was mistakenly seen as a Japanese American, and this was during the time where there was tension economy, specifically the car industry, how they were competing with the American automobile industry, and tensions were at a high, and this was the largest hate crime cases that Asian American community come together. So it's really with that backdrop, growing up in the Midwest and going to college only 6 years after, that really brought me to really think about what does it mean to be Asian American, also growing up in the Midwest. Also the lens of like, how do we fight for Asian American studies, or how do we create a culture on college campuses that are going to be more conducive for all students. And so that's when I came to Washington, D.C. and started my work at Organization of Chinese Americans for 10 years. And through that time period, that's when we came up with the idea of AAPIVote. It's really been the last 3 years. I've actually been based in Washington, D.C., but always focusing on building political power for the AAPI community nationally and focusing on the grassroots.
Very cool. Very, very cool. We are having a little bit of issue with your audio from time to time. I'm still understanding you, so we're good there. But if it keeps going, we might want to turn your camera off. So I'll keep you posted just in case. But so far, audio is good, is great. All right, so let's talk about some of the history and the mission behind APIAVote. Now, you've told us what led you to it. Do you think that this was a movement that had been growing and would have continued absent your involvement in this, or do you think that this has been, y'all's participation has been really pivotal to making some of the changes and some of the history that y'all have made so far?
Right. So 1996, when we conceived the idea, we recognized that even though the community was growing, and we were building a number of different AAPI civil rights advocacy organizations to ensure that we had a place at the table to actually voice our concerns and to advocate on different issues. We realized we were behind Black, Latinos, the women's communities, the youth community, because our community was not voting at the same rate as others, right? And so that's when we decided we needed to start an institution focusing on that. It was in 2007 when after I had retired from OCA that we decided it was time to really, be able to prop up this organization and to work with all the different existing organizations across the country to build their capacity to actually do this work. When we first started, a lot of the nonprofits in our community were hesitant. They thought, oh, it's political. As a nonprofit, we're not allowed to do this work. Culturally is also taboo about talking about politics. And so it's really, we believe that it is because of the work of APIAVote and our grassroots partners and how we've been able to expand that we've been able to reach this pivotal point in 2020, just as the community is also and so with that, for APIAVote, before 2020, we would say that only half of our community was registered and ready to go vote. We had the largest increase in 2020 than any other community, under 60%. And we continue to build upon that. We've already saw that in 2022, as well as we prepare now. We actually have more community organizations focusing on local elections now, right? So it is always about turning voters and organizations not think about elections being once every 4 years or once every 2 years, but local, state, city council, school board elections are just as important. I think because of what we faced as a community in 2020, it was not only about the presidential election, the primaries in general, it was also about getting out the count for the census. But because of the infrastructure we built back in, even in 2019, getting ready for the 2020 elections, we were able to then address also the rise of anti-Asian violence, as well as the impact of the pandemic on our communities. And because we also saw how decisions were being made at the state, local, and federal level, voters in our community finally realized, it's like, we need to get involved, we need to go vote, because when before I didn't pay attention, but now I understand how government impacts my life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think 2020 was a large learning experience for a lot of people when it comes to, what choices the government makes determine, many things in our own lives. But you're right, that continued or renewed interest in the local level. It's really easy to be like, I don't care who's school board president. I don't, I'm child free. I don't really have skin in the game there. But I will never vote against a school board levy in my area because I don't like living with stupid people. So please go to school, have all the money you need for it. This is something that we want to support. So I think that is really wonderful that y'all are thinking not just on the grand scale. Okay, so let's talk about some of the strategies. I want to know what some of the most effective strategies have been at mobilizing voters. And do you think that, or have you changed those strategies when it comes to either different areas of the country or different levels of government or levels of engagement that you're trying to encourage?
Right. So let me specifically talk about Asian Americans. Over 2/3 of this community, first generation immigrants. And so they're actually the fastest growing immigrant population, faster than the Latino community in terms of percentages. And so knowing that, also 1/3 of them are also limited English proficient. So we know one key thing we need to ensure that we also reach out in a culturally competent manner, as well as providing translated materials and engagement. So our strategy, for instance, in 2022, we were able to raise enough money to be able to reach out to 1 million households with translated mail in 33 different versions, because depending on the state and depending what community that was limited English proficient that we were targeting, we had to make sure that we had different languages provided in this mailer. So every mailer has 2 languages plus English. Because in a household, you can also have someone like me who may not read in a different language, but I may pick up that mailer where mom and dad who may be living with me will read it in a particular language. Then it's, followed up like with all general practices of phone banking, door knocking, text banking, digital ads as any other campaign. But the key is also we provide a toll-free number, a hotline that you could provide, we can actually provide in-language assistance. And so in 2020, when that mailer hit, we received thousands of phone calls on this hotline where people asking questions in language. So we know this works and that there's still a need, especially since we are focusing of what campaigns call lower propensity voters. So they're first-time voters. They may be 18 to 29-year-olds, or they may be limited English proficient. The other strategy is also recognizing that our growing population is also among the younger voters. So it's also important, like for instance, we have a college program where the work that we do with community-based organizations, we're trying to set up the infrastructure on college campuses so they could also do the same type of work. So it, especially when college campuses, they're also trying to decide, should I vote locally or back at home? And also they're dealing with other issues of voter ID and voter suppression, depending on what state they're in.
Yeah, I think that is really big. I mean, this is very important to highlight things like, language barriers that are absolutely there for people. And you're right, depending on where they're located in the country, they might be of the, of a group that has been welcomed into the community, or they might not. They might exist someplace where it is a bit of a separate situation. You know, they've either created their own like insular communities, or they just haven't been welcome in the, you know, and encouraged to bring their culture and bring themselves to the larger community. And I like this idea of voter suppression too, because that's a real thing.
Also, I want to add that what we found in 2020 as well as 2022 is that over 2/3 of our community are choosing to vote early or by mail. And when we saw in 2020 that more states provide that opportunity, we believe that also helped increase the voter participation rate of our communities. Because think about it, if you're limited English proficient or you're a new immigrant trying to like figure out the ballot and understand what, you know, where are all the different candidates, it's easier to be able to sit at home with your family members or friends to discuss it and be at least to fill out your ballot and then turn it in. So we believe that as more states provide that opportunity on a regular basis, that actually helps us increase our participation rate. At the same time, we know that in 2022, Texas and Georgia made it harder for early voting and for mail-in ballots. And as a result, we saw a lower rate of participation in terms of early voting from our communities.
I mean, it makes a ton of sense. You know, it really does matter, you know, down to like kind of the smallest issues that might impact these numbers and, you know, the turnout that we see. I mean, English is my native language, and voting still stresses me the hell out. Like going in there, like I'll have a list literally in my hand of like, here's who I want to vote for, because even though I speak the language and I vaguely understand the process, it's still weirdly scary. Like you're going to make a wrong choice or something. It's very weird. And so it really makes a ton of sense that, you know, some people prefer to do this slowly and do it at home. Some people prefer to have the time to not only take a look at the candidates, but to do that research in the language that they are most proficient in. You know, I think that that is really important. All right, so let's talk a little bit more. We'll kind of move big picture. What do you think are the issues that are most salient to AAPI voters? Are they things that we would normally, like we'd hear and think like, oh yeah, that's got a connection there? Or are there some issues that might not seem like they should be like concerning to the community, but they are?
Right. Well, you know, the top issues are quite similar to what you've been hearing nationally, is like healthcare, jobs, and economy. But I would say, especially the sense of anti-Asian violence, crime and safety is also has now propped up a lot higher. Gun control actually has been an issue for quite a long time, but I think that people are, and the, you know, people are actually not necessarily thinking about the Asian American community and gun control, but especially now with the shootings in Allen, Texas, most recently to Monterey Park and Half Moon Bay in California. This has actually increasingly become an issue that we're all talking about. But even before, you know, this year, I would say gun control is also a top issue that people, and environment. Actually, Asian American and Pacific Islanders are large environmentalists. They do it in practice. They may not necessarily talk about it as much, but in terms of how they function, what their values are, we find that in our polling and our survey work, that environment is actually extremely important as well. Now, you know, considering our community is 2/3 immigrant, first generation immigrants, you know, a lot of people think, well, what about immigration? Well, immigration is always in the back of our heads because whatever your immigration status will actually impact your access to healthcare, to jobs and economy, education. So even though we may not necessarily say, oh, immigration is top issue, you realize that we're always bringing that lens to whatever issue we're looking at.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point to make, you know, that there are, I think by and large, granted, this is based on, you know, very entrenched stereotyping and a lot of media narrative, but I feel like when it comes to things like gun violence, most of the stuff you hear about is about either Black people or white people. And there's a lot to unpack there separately, but it is, I think, very important to remember that these are not, these issues do not just affect one demographic. There are always multiples, always. And, you know, really looking in terms of what the population demographic actually looks like. I think a lot of us don't necessarily have a good picture of if it is largely an older generation. Are you in the situation that a lot of white people are in, where like the boomers and are kind of still running stuff? Or are you looking at a demographic that's a lot more younger than people would really expect? So I mean, these details are really important when it comes to trying to figure out what issues are most important to the voters themselves, as well as what issues have the greatest impact on them, because they might not be the same thing.
Right.
All right.
And, I think, go ahead.
Oh, no, please go ahead. People want to hear you talk, not me.
So I think that also leads to, what we also found. So APIAVote, every 2 years since 2012, we conduct an Asian American voter survey, which is in language. And what we have found is that also that the political parties are not reaching out to our community, even though it's going, and there's been improvements from both Democrats and Republicans, but overall, over 50% of our community are still not being reached out to. Democrats are doing a little bit better than Republicans, but also when we asked in our survey of issue importance and if which party is doing better on a wide variety of different issues, I would say that over 30 to 35% say that there's no difference between Democrats and Republicans. So that also tells me that political campaigns and parties and even advocacy organizations aren't engaging enough with the API electorate, which is growing, and making them understand, like in terms of what's the difference between all the different candidates and the parties in itself.
I think that's a really good point to make. There's, to a certain extent, that does encourage, or it seems encouraging in terms of people not just voting a party line, which we've seen multiple times. I consider myself an independent, but generally speaking, I do vote Democrat a lot of the time, but I'm also not a party. I'm not a party voter. It's, if you have a D next to your name, that does not mean you're automatically getting my vote. So I think that it is really important to kind of parse out, because it's very easy to think that if the people who are campaigning and the people who are reaching these levels of government and have this control and influence over our lives, if neither side is really paying attention to this demographic, then yeah, it's very easy to feel like, well, it doesn't matter who's in charge. I'm kind of screwed either way. So I think that is really, really important. Do you think that there are political campaigns that are actually looking into AAPI voters, or do you think this is still a trend that has yet to really expand across the political landscape?
So like I said, throughout the last decade, there has been vast improvements. I would say the Democrats for the longest time had begun their efforts a lot earlier, starting in the 90s, where they had hired an Asian American Pacific Islander outreach director within the DNC infrastructure. Also, just in general, like when you look and scan the number of AAPIs running for office and winning, the large majority tend to be Democrats. So there's a larger infrastructure there. But at the same time, over the past decade, the Republicans started to also hire their own staff, invest dollars in engaging with the API community. And, this is where growing population, I think before, people were not thinking about API voters in Nevada or Arizona or Georgia and Virginia. But as you can see, the last decade, there's been local races, statewide races, and then the presidential, where because our growing population and organizing, that we are an important component in electorates that they need to win over to be able to win their elections, right? But in terms of overall party identification, it also varies within the Asian ethnic communities. We see that Japanese and Indian American communities tend to be a lot more Democratic leaning. Vietnamese communities are a lot more Republican. But interestingly enough, the Chinese community, which tended to be a lot more Democrat in the last 10 years, are now the largest both the community, 42% identifies independent, more than any other Asian ethnic community. So I think it's really a mixture in terms of what they were hearing from, in terms of how they were dealing with the pandemic and the rhetoric surrounding the presidential elections, that they really are torn and really are identifying as independent voters. So it's an interesting phenomenon to see, but it's also something that we flag with the political parties and also other advocacy organizations that are doing political campaigns.
Excellent. Oh, okay. All right. So we've only got a couple minutes left, but I wanted to make sure we tackle this one question. Let's talk about some of the obstacles and challenges that lie ahead when you are trying to increase AAPI civic engagement, especially as we do near a big US election year. 2024 is going to be, it's going to be a thing, y'all. So as we look forward to this, what do you think are the obstacles that are facing that engagement?
Well, I think when we say there's the rise of anti-Asian violence, I think folks tend to think of like 2020 and 2021, especially with the Atlanta shootings and what after that. The reality is that Asian Americans are still being attacked all across the country, and we're very much concerned as the rhetoric between US-China heats up, and as political campaigns and candidates debate one another, they may want to one-up each other, and we're really afraid about the rhetoric when there are huge concerns about the Chinese government and the regime that their government is falling under right now. But there's a difference between that and the Chinese people, as well as the Chinese American and Asian Americans. But unfortunately, a lot of people don't necessarily differentiate that. So we are concerned about the rhetoric that will happen and how that will actually increase anti-Asian hate. Also, as there continues to be attacks on voting rights, like I said, early voting options is the most preferred way for our community to be able to go vote. And so we're always trying to making sure that we fight right now for voting rights and making sure it's accessible. But the other thing is making the case for campaigns and also funders who are looking at funding even nonpartisan activities to look into how we could utilize those funds for translating materials and engagement by trusted messengers within the community. It's always best to actually have your own neighbor, your own organizations within your own community reaching out and engaging versus someone parachuting in from another state, right?
No, that makes a ton of sense. Okay.
One other thing I would say is misinformation, especially when we're talking about AI, but it also how that plays out in the Asian American Pacific Islander communities. Many of them are on other platforms like WeChat, Kakao, WhatsApp, in language private communities where they're speaking to their friends in language. So a lot of mis and disinformation gets spread out that way. So we really need a larger army of volunteers to really check their own family and friends conversations and get into those spaces and to be, to actually understand how do we actually address this and be really active in engaging with our family members on that.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. I don't think a lot of us realized until probably 2020, the kind of influence that we can have and the spaces and rooms that we occupy that are not available to other people. And so I find that very interesting and very important to remember that I might have access to people and to situations that would not be open to someone who really needs these people's opinions to change. They need to be better educated. And so I take that very seriously. I because of the work I do with Power Fly, I am exposed to a lot more diversity issues than most of my, my family or my community. And so when I am someplace and people ask me what I do, I won't shut up, because like, it's important that we have these conversations, especially in the demographics that are not affected by this. So the idea of that misinformation spreading, especially between like family members or friends, it's going to be a lot faster. Any doubt that you might have about a link that you see on Facebook, you might not have any doubts at all if it's, your cousin sending you the link, or your mom or your grandma. It is really important to kind of confront that on all the issues, like all the forefronts where it exists. All right, we're almost to the end of time today. What would you like to reply first? And then I'll ask my last question.
Well, first of all, I would like to thank you for, shining and highlighting the Asian American and Pacific Islander electorate, or AAPI as we call it. It is also, as we head into this election, I think it's also really important to, whenever we see data and polling, for us to also question, where is the data on Asian American and Pacific Islanders, and also in some places Native American communities? Because in a lot of these battleground states and tight races, our electorate is just as important. But unfortunately, we're always missing from the data. And as a result, we're not necessarily always being thought about, just because the data is also missing.
Yeah. Ooh, very good point there. Okay, last question. If people want to oh gosh, English, Megan, it's the only language you speak. If people want to follow up with you, connect with you, contribute to the cause, what do you want them to know? Where should we direct them?
Right. So a wide variety of social media platforms. All you have to do is look up APIAVote. And we could also, and our website is APIVote.org. We also, like I said, we work with local nonprofit communities in over 29 states. So we can also definitely connect you up with local partners and get involved locally. Even though, like I said, there's a lot of work that we do in language, there's also a large bulk of our community that we just need to still engage. So we're looking for a wide variety of volunteers, supporters, donors. Once again, a lot of what people don't realize is that the API receive less than 1% of all corporate funding and less than half of 1% of all foundation dollars. So this is really an under-resourced community that we're really trying to think of as 2020, as we see the growth of our community, not only the electorate, but also population, that hopefully people are paying attention now.
Excellent. All right. I have shared a link in the chat thread to APIAVote's main page. I've also put a couple more answers in the chat for people that had quick questions. Christine, I just want to say a huge thank you. Thank you for spending your time with us today, sharing your expertise. It has been wonderful to learn more about this subject with you, and I really hope that we get a chance to connect again soon.
Great. Thank you so much.